Okay, David, it's all yours.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the start of day 2 of the Mastery Grading Conference. We're still here. So on this slide, there's a couple of links you might want to know about. Everything to do with the conference is on masterygrading.com. And this link to the Slack community is something that Robert put together and you might find very useful. This is also linked to grading.com. This is a great place to continue discussing things afterwards. So right now I'm going to hand it back over to Sharona for a minute.
Okay, so just our standard disclaimer, we are recording this webinar. We do plan to post recordings and the slides so you can review them later. And we're retaining the right to rebroadcast and distribute these recordings. We had a question yesterday. Yes, you're welcome to record. You're welcome to screen share. We're just making sure that we do have the rights because we're going to be posting these. And by participating, you're agreeing that your contributions become a part of the recording. For panelists, this includes video. For everybody else, that includes audio, chat, and Q&A. Also, I did get a comment just now that people feel like they're missing things on the chat. We are going to be posting a transcript of the chat as well. So we're going to try and get it all out there to you. And then next, we wanted to huge thank you to College Bridge, which can be found at college-bridge.org. That's a local nonprofit here in California that Bosley and I work with that is committed to aligning mathematics pathways for success for K-12 through college. And we are so grateful to their support. They're paying for all of the back-end Zoom links as well as for some of the time for the support personnel. So we couldn't have pivoted this to online without them. Also, quick announcement, Bosley and I and some other people are involved. We're going to be teaching a course, a 4-week, once-a-week course on transitioning mathematics to online instruction best practices. So not the emergency pivot, but sort of the next steps. And as Mastery Grading Conference attendees, you will get 10% off of that. So if you're interested, go to college-bridge.org, sign up to be notified, and the first course will start in a couple of weeks. So I think was there anything else I was supposed to say, David?
I did want to answer a quick question from the Q&A that the table talk rooms are not being recorded, but the panels and such we are recording. So table talk rooms are entirely yours. I'm going to give you a quick overview of the day and then hand it over to today's speakers. So we're going to start. So today is the day of nuts and bolts. Yesterday we had a lot of high-level overview, big picture things. Today, how do you do this on the ground? And so we're going to begin with a collection of speakers talking about a paper they wrote and a process they have developed, the Build-a-Syllabus Workshop, to help you get started planning a class. We'll have a break and then a table talk session, which I realized I didn't label table talk. It's the Build-a-Syllabus breakouts, where you can talk about the previous session and also start thinking about how you might plan your own class to use Mastery Grading. So then after another coffee break, we're going to start a series of parallel sessions on different nuts and bolts topics. So a couple parallel sessions, a tea break, and then 3 more parallel sessions you can choose from. And one thing to watch out for down here at 4:30 Eastern time, from the last set of parallel sessions into our very brief goodbye and next steps sessions, there's no break between those two. So the only time in the conference we don't have a break between those sessions. So please watch those. We'll be sure to end the last set of parallel sessions promptly. All right, with that, I am going to turn it over to Emily, Justin, Tom, and Chad, who will also introduce themselves, and they're going to take over this morning's session on the Build-a-Syllabus Workshop.
So hi, everyone. I'm Justin Dunmeyer. I'm at Frostburg State University, which is in Western Maryland, and we'll pass it off to Emily for introductions.
Hi, I'm Emily Shirley Turner. I'm at University of Laverne in Southern California.
I'm Tom Mahoney from Emporia State University.
And I'm Chad Wiley, and I'm also from Emporia State University.
So I want to give a brief overview about what we're going to be talking about in this session. Our paper, which is the Build-a-Syllabus Workshop, is in the resources for this conference. It's also available through Primus. And this presentation is based on that paper, which is itself was an interesting vision by the editors of that special edition. So Emily and I had written a paper about what we thought were the big questions one should ask before writing a mastery-based syllabus. And Chad and Tom had done a deep dive into Rachel Weir's repository and written about the themes that they saw therein. And the editor said, well, these papers really belong together. And so they asked us to merge those. And so we're quite excited today to present an overview of that paper. So we'll be walking you through the questions and sub-questions, because what good question doesn't lead to more questions, as well as how we personally approach those questions. Our paper does contain references to more than 50 other syllabi than the ones we're going to talk about here. So we hope that that serves as a good springboard for you as you build your own syllabus. And then we'll end this with a quick tour of our missteps along the way. And if they can get me to shut up, maybe we'll have some time for questions. So Emily will lead us into our first question, and you'll have a chance to hear from each of us before we move on to the next. Emily?
All right, so the first question is, what learning objectives will I measure? And we kind of see this as the main question, or the question where if you answer this, then you can build the other questions around it. So basically, when you identify what learning objectives you want to measure, then that will help you create assessments. It will help you determine how many assessments you should have. It will help you define your grading scheme. So this is kind of a big one. So for this, you really want to think about what topics are critical. And I'll say this from personal experience, you really have to define this for yourself. What you think is critical and what your colleague thinks is critical may be totally different. So while the syllabi and the repository are really good, it's a good idea to kind of sit down, maybe look at past final exams that you have and think about, what do I want to measure? What does a person coming out of this class, what kind of things should they know? But given that there's actually different types of learning objectives, and we expand on this more in the paper, but basically you can have, specific learning objectives just about, performing on a particular topic or skill. They could be more general, so maybe around some process, performing a process rather than a single thing. And we're not going to talk about this because I don't think any of us do this, but there are some syllabi in the repository that have more procedural type of things. So perhaps you want students to show good mathematical communication or things like that. So there's other types of objectives that you could have as well. So we've identified, or really, I think David identified some of these sub-questions. What skill-based objectives must students meet? What broad or process-based objectives must students meet? And what other requirements must students meet? So we're gonna all talk a little bit about what we do. And I think, Tom, are you first up?
Yeah. So some people in our department joke that Chad and I are essentially the same person, except that they all say that he's nicer than I am. I may or may not agree with that at times, but the degree to which they're right can be a little bit scary. So for any given course, Chad and I are likely to converge upon very similar syllabi. So that you don't have to hear the same things from us twice. We're each going to talk about different kinds of courses. So just know that the ideas that I talk about and that Chad talked about would be something that either of us would probably use or has done in the past. In answering these 4 questions, I'll be focusing on how Chad and I structure our skill-based courses. These would be things like calculus or college algebra. These are courses where I want students to demonstrate that they have mastered particular skills, or that are in a special subject area, because these skills might be required in future courses. On the other hand, Chad's going to tell you more about how we tend to approach our proof-based courses, such as abstract algebra, real analysis, or an intro to proofwriting course. Some courses we teach, such as linear algebra, involve blends of ideas from both of these categories. And in answering this first question for skill-based courses, I define my objectives based on the sections that I cover from the textbook. Usually I end up with about 1 objective per section, which for a 5-credit calculus 1 or 2 course is about 25 objectives. When I was starting out with mastery grading, this setup made the transition a lot easier because it was conceptually similar to the objectives I would have measured in a traditionally graded course. Some of the objectives I use for calculus include I can compute a limit using L'Hopital's rule. I can use the fundamental theorem of calculus to do stuff. In college algebra, I might ask them to apply horizontal vertical shifts. And sometimes I have like a compound objective. So in this last example, it's using linear equations for point slope, slope intercept, standard form, taking a point and a slope or 2 points. I want to ask all the things about writing down the equational line. I might not test every single one of those in the same assessment, but that compound assessment is kind of expressing all the things that I want to check about that topic. Now I'll pass it to Chad for his thoughts.
All right, so like Tom said, he and I tend to do pretty similar things. So while he talks about the lower division classes, I'm going to be talking about the upper division classes that we teach. And these tend to be more focused on proof and reasoning and writing skills. For those of you who aren't in math specifically, these are a lot more writing intensive. The problems tend to be, instead of just like computing something or being able to perform some particular skill, writing little essays and little logical arguments. So the approach is different. I tend to use more of a specs grading approach for these kinds of classes, and I think it fits better. Part of the reason is was articulated by Joshua Bowman. I'm going to steal a quote from him from MathFest a few years back, that standards-based grading is really more about what students know, and specs is more about what students do. And so in these upper level classes, I really want to build good habits, especially good writing habits. So I will have content objectives, but they tend to be pretty broad. Things like, students will be able to identify topologies and topological spaces, which there's a lot in there. But then I'll also have writing objectives. Like I want them to be good communicators of mathematics, and that's where a lot of the focus is. Many of my specs courses are online because of the way Emporia State runs its upper level classes, its graduate classes in particular. And so in those classes, I often have a sort of unofficial objective of trying to build a class community. I think that's important in an online course. So I'll typically have students participate in discussion threads to build connections with other students, and also to build connections with broader mathematical ideas. So they might, for instance, connect the stuff they're learning in one class to things that they learn in a different class, or they might make connections between the things they're learning and stuff that's happening in their lives. All right, I believe Justin is up next.
Yep. So I tend, like when I think about a calculus course, I tend to go towards big, broad objectives that I can really get at a multiple different ways. So, right, you can see here on the slide, I have, this is my entire calculus course. It's these 12 objectives. And for some of the skill type things, I rely on gateway style exams. So, something you need like a 75% to get a pass on that exam. And that exam tests a variety of techniques. So I don't have separate standards for the product rule, the quotient rule, chain rule, etc. But I do ask some questions, like I can interpret the derivative as a rate of change. That might come out of a variety of different questions. And then I do have other kind of shadow requirements for a B or an A. I'll get to that a little bit later, but things like communication, attention to detail, these are important to me and they factor into my grading, but they're not separate articulated standards. On the other hand, for courses like my Intro to Proofs class, I don't set individual objectives. Instead, I use something very similar to what Chad will be talking about later. So I'll just leave that to him. Emily?
Right, so I do kind of a mixture of what's previously been talked about, and I noticed there's some questions in the Q&A about this. So I do, topic-based standards, which tend to cover 1 to 3 sections in the textbook, depending, on what that topic is. For my brief-based courses, I include concept check things, which are more applying definitions and proofwriting standards. And there's an example given here. I should shout out that this was borrowed heavily from Rachel Weir's syllabi, so she may recognize it if she's here. And proofs are graded on both correctness and style. So I think we'll talk a little bit later about defining mastery, but that's how those go. And then I include all kinds of other things that students must do besides just the standards and assessing on the standards, such as like projects, learning community, which I stole from Justin. That's more of a what you students do in class, and sometimes that includes participation. And then I often have portfolio or application problems. So there's kind of some other things that students need to show mastery on, which are put into a bundle, which we'll talk about later. So I think, Tom, are you next?
All right. So this is getting into question 2. Once you decide what objectives you want to measure, what objectives you want students to master, you have to decide what you mean by mastery, as well as how you plan on measuring that mastery. This includes decisions about whether to use quizzes or exams or projects or homework sets to assess mastery. Maybe you want a binary pass-revise system, or maybe you want a more refined system with multiple levels of mastery, like EMRN. In demonstrating mastery of an objective, is it something that students only need to do once, or should students demonstrate mastery a certain number of times? Of course, it's not enough to just measure mastery. It is absolutely vital that students know where they stand in the course. So you have to think about how you're going to communicate students' progress towards mastering objectives. And up first is Chad.
All right, so for my upper division courses, I'm typically measuring mastery of both the content and the writing objectives by looking at student homework proofs. So the usual workflow is they'll have a certain number of problems assigned each week, and I will pick a subset of those to grade. And those are going to be graded on, well, I'll talk in a second about how I grade them. I do want to mention before I dive into that I typically don't give exams in my upper level classes just for philosophical reasons. So, but I will often include a sort of like a capstone project, like a presentation or a portfolio that they need to do just to kind of to demonstrate overall understanding at the end. But the big focus in the class is on the proofs, and so those are graded on a pass-revise scale. So I just use a 2-tier grading system for these. And the criteria that I use are they need to provide logically correct arguments, and they need to provide clear writing. And I think that both of those are really important in terms of becoming a good mathematician and a good mathematical communicator. And so they both need to be up to an acceptable level before I'm willing to give the problem a pass. They don't have to be perfect. This is echoing what I think Amanda said yesterday, that they can have like, they can be a little bit off and still be up to what I would consider an acceptable level. But I'm also willing to say if they have an argument that's logically correct, like they're going through the correct steps, but I think it's too hard to read, it's written in a very confusing way, or there's too much like shorthand in it, then I think it's completely fair to go back and have them redo that to build some of those better skills. So revisions are critical. This I think is important because 1, I want to measure eventual mastery. I don't want to measure mastery right out of the gate. And 2, to echo something that Robert has said, this is more like what professional mathematics is like. You know, the way that we actually do mathematics as professionals is this sort of back and forth process. Like, you know, you submit a paper to a journal, they give you some notes back on it, and you do a back and forth thing. But the way we often teach mathematics is different than that. It's like a one-shot thing, and then you get a grade, and that's it. And so I think this is better to prepare them for what they might be doing later in their careers. So every proof that they submit gets some feedback on it. If it gets a revise, I will highlight things that I think they need to change, or things that they need to do better on future revisions. Even if it's a passing proof, I will sometimes put notes on it just to give them an idea of, you know, this is good enough, this is acceptable, but I think there are still things you may be able to do better in the future. In terms of communicating grades to students, it's a little tricky because Canvas really loves its percentages, and I'm not grading in a percentage-based way. So my gradebook isn't that great, but I do have it set up so that it at least shows students how many problems they've passed, which is the main thing that they need to know. All right, let's turn it over to Justin.
I do things a little bit differently. So I tend to have all of my mastery measured on in-class quizzes, although something happened this semester that made me a lot more comfortable with take-home quizzes. I can't quite put my finger on it. But my quizzes are graded on a 3-tier system, right? I have a not yet, I have a pass, and a pass plus. The difference between a pass and a pass plus is that each of my quizzes has 2 questions, kind of a basic question and what I call a reach question. The reach question is much more conceptual, requires some synthesis of ideas. If you get the basic question right, up to things like arithmetic errors like we saw yesterday, you get the pass. If you get both right, you get the pass plus. And that's my main tool there. I do like having a final exam. I've found that the cumulative final is a good opportunity for synthesis for the whole course. I make it points based, and I use it as a final grade modifier. So based on your learning objectives, based on your mastery there, you have a pre-final grade of A through F. And then if you score higher than 90% on the final, then you move up a letter grade. If you score below a threshold, you move down. And I found that this lets me give a final exam that also feels kind of safe, right? If you have an A student and they're an A before, but they dropped below 75%, maybe they weren't so strong after all. Maybe there's some artifact in the quizzes that you're looking at. So it gives me a little bit of safety. But my students quite like it, especially students who are landing at a B. They see it as their Hail Mary, right? They can get to that A with that final push. And I've had several students do that. For individual mastery, it depends on the course and the target. Something that I think is really important, like interpreting the derivative, maybe it has more quizzes available to it. So it may have 7 total quizzes throughout the whole semester. And so I expect you to pass at least 2 of those. For something like in my differential equations course, on the other hand, every learning objective appears on exactly 2 quizzes. And so you have to pass one or the other. As far as communication goes, when I'm good, I like printed grade slips or having a good thing in my LMS. We use Canvas here. Canvas can be used to show grades as like not yet, pass, pass plus. I have a colleague who's tricked the final percentage readout to always say C syllabus. That's quite nice. But honestly, I'm not always up to date on that. So I try to have at least a printed grade tracker for the students. And I think it's a valuable first homework assignment in any mastery syllabus or any mastery grading course to give students something like a printed grade tracker and say, what grade does this student get at the end of the semester? That helps communicate exactly what's going on here. How about you, Emily?
Yeah, so I do quizzes in like a quiz session format. So, you know, we'll have quiz sessions. Students can take a quiz on a particular standard. And I make each quiz cover 1 standard. So that actually turns out to become somewhat self-paced later on, where I have all kinds of different students taking all kinds of different standards. And so it does become a little bit cumbersome sometimes with like printing them out and making sure I have the right ones. And I'm going to steal some ideas that I saw yesterday in the 5-minute talks. But that's for my sort of lower level courses. The proof-based courses, they'll also have homework sets covering some proofwriting standards. And some of the proofwriting standards have to be passed on not just homework, but also on a quiz. Because the homework ones are in theory infinitely revisable. So they can, you know, keep turning in revisions. I sometimes give a final exam, sometimes not, depends mostly on the course. If I do give a final exam, it's a points-based grade modifier like Justin talked about. I tend to do it just 2-tiered, so above a 90, grade goes up, below a 50 or 55, something like that, grade goes down, otherwise grade stays the same. And sometimes I just won't have a final at all, and the finals week will just be used for revisions and reattempts. I had already built that into my syllabus this past semester, which was great because I didn't want to give an online final. And in order to shore grades, we use Blackboard, which Blackboard has many, many flaws, but the one nice thing is that you can input the grade on an assignment as text. So I will set it to that, and I'll put in pass or revise or whatever. And then students are always kind of aware of their grade. Not to say that they don't ask questions about it, because they still do, but at least they can see all the things that I've recorded when I get around to recording them. But I often send quarterly grade updates to students. So this is more to just establish norms. I think, I'm sure it was talked about yesterday, but students need to be constantly reminded about this system, I've found. And so that's just to say, hey, here's what you have now, here's what I have recorded for you, and here's the syllabus, maybe match this up and understand, how to compute your own grade. So that's worked for me. And I think we're moving into the new Blackboard pretty soon, so hopefully it'll be even easier. But that's worked for me so far. Tom?
All right. I, across all my courses, almost exclusively use a binary pass-reattempt system, primarily with quizzes covering a single objective in my skill-based courses. A pass is reserved for work that is nearly perfect, except for maybe an error that I would consider to be insignificant to the objective being measured. But for such a restrictive system, there can feel like a lot of edge cases, especially when trying to determine which errors are considered insignificant, which ones are considered significant. For any non-obvious case, I always have a guiding question. I ask, will the student benefit from trying this again? Will the student benefit from trying this again? Student learning is, after all, the end goal, so this question helps me to focus on that goal. And I might even answer that question differently for different students or in different situations. Students may earn up to 2 passes on each objective, and exams are an opportunity to earn a pass on each standard covered. Next slide, please. I keep track of student progress using pivot tables, and it has been superior to everything that I've tried before that, between individual web pages and messy CSV file stuff. The learning curve can be a bit steep, but the idea is that you use a spreadsheet to keep a ledger of every single event. For example, Chad Wiley took a quiz on June 2nd in office hours over derivatives and earned a pass, and it was version 2 of that quiz. Each column represents something you want to track: name, date, objective, result, version, maybe location, whether it's an office hour retake or in-class attempt. Then you use pivot tables in Excel or Google Sheets to turn this information into a more standard-looking gradebook, but you don't throw away that extra information of when stuff happened. Then I can use this pivot table to create a mail merge report that I send to students with just clicking one button each week, and it blasts out an email where every student gets their weekly progress report. I've been meaning to make YouTube videos to show you exactly how to do this, and I'm happy to say that I took a little break yesterday and made the first video, and then another break this morning to write a second video. I'll have links for those in the chat very soon. But now we're on to question 3 with Chad.
All right, so question 3 is, how am I going to translate student progress into a grade? And I think from the student point of view, this is maybe the biggest one that they're going to have. How do I get a grade, right? That's what they're going to be focused on. And so you have to think pretty hard about this. Probably the most natural starting point is something that David mentioned yesterday. What would I expect from a C student? And then, you extrapolate, what would I expect from a B student? What would I expect from an A student? And you want to try and make this clear to them. Now, you can answer this question in a lot of ways. For instance, you can go with the traditional, weighted averages and percentages system. That's something that you might see if you're doing like a minimalist, bare bones implementation where like maybe only part of your course is graded on mastery and the rest of it is graded traditionally. Or you could go in the other direction to the popular bundles idea where every grade has a specific list of requirements that students have to meet in order to get it. So however you decide to implement that, one of the extremes or kind of a mixture of the two. You also have to think about some ancillary questions like, for instance, do you want to use plus minus grading, or do you have to use plus minus grading? Some schools require it. And if you do, how are you going to implement that? Is it based on just how close they get to a cutoff, or I've seen people do things like, have it based on performance on a final exam. There's different options you can use. And whatever you put together, and it very much can be like a sort of jigsaw puzzle, putting together different pieces. You want to try and plan ahead and think about what are the twists or pitfalls that students might encounter, so you can you can sort them out before students get to them. So we're going to have Justin start us off with what he does to answer these questions.
Yeah, so I use a bundling system. So what you can see is a student who earns an A or a B or a C in my course has met these minimum requirements. So the first thing is core competency or core mastery. They've completed that if I'm looking at the A student column. They've also have more than 90% of their works be pass, pass plus, or revised. And more than 80% of their works are pass plus level. They have 90% of their learning community points, and they have 90% of their homework checks. And so I want to take a moment to talk about core competency. I see this as defining, like, this is my minimum to say, yeah, you've got this class, right? You have to show this level to me. And I usually just define it as earning a pass on some subset of learning targets or learning objectives. And that may be specified, or that may be on a category basis. So if I think about calculus, for instance, under interpretation, probably for interpretation, I want both of my learning objectives mastered there. I don't want a student moving on from calculus if they can't interpret derivatives and interpret integrals. But maybe I don't care that they have absolutely everything under utilization. I want them to show me that they can do one of those four things or two of those four things in order to earn that C. For computational mastery, which is another one in there, it should be a category. Maybe they have to earn that too. And then there was a question in the Q&A about what's the difference between a pass and a pass plus? And to me, those pass pluses are those conceptual questions. They're those reach questions. And I really care about how many times when you saw that question for the first time, did you get it right? Did you make meaningful progress on it? And so for me, that distinguishes a student between earning a B or an A in the course. So you can see that pass plus level is a main determiner there. And there was also early on in the chat, there was a question about how do you talk about things that maybe don't fit so clearly into your learning objectives, or maybe you want to talk about growth mindset, which I think is super important. Thank you for bringing that up. And but you don't want to necessarily have a target or a quiz on it. I use homework for that kind of thing, and to keep that kind of holistic view of an assignment. What I use for homework is I have one concept per assignment. That might be multiple questions, or it might be read an article and reflect on it. And you get the first point for attempting it, and you get the second point for if you, across all those questions that I'm asking, show me that you know the concept. And then if you have the concept point, then you can also get points for attention to detail and presentation. And this is quite quick. It's very easy to look over a homework assignment and say, yeah, they've got the concept. Yeah, their notation's good. Yeah, their presentation's good. I didn't have a hard time reading it. 4 checks, move on. And one of the key things from we want to value mistakes, right? Is to say that, this is oh no, I lost my slide. Well, this is exciting. Is the first time it's assigned, it's due the next class. It's a very quick turnaround, but I call that the first draft. And I mark it up like a first draft. I say, okay, here it is. I've marked this off. I've marked that off. This notation's bad. It's clear you don't have the concept here. You need to think of this. And then I hand it back and say, okay, if you're happy with your grade, that's your grade. But otherwise, you have 2 weeks to turn in a final draft. So Emily was going to talk next about translating progress into letter grades, right?
Yeah, thankfully I have the slide in front of me. Okay. So
slide in just a moment.
Oh. So I think we've talked about bundles a little bit, but that's sort of what I do. It's something similar to what Justin does, where you need a minimum number of standards that have been passed. I think 1 back from there, actually. Yeah.
Working on it.
So minimum number of standards passed. Sometimes that is, a number, and it could be any standards. Sometimes it's particular standards that need to be passed. And, you know, I always kind of start with what is the C letter grade, and then move up from there. So often, you know, the B's and the A's are doing more things or doing better things. And then the learning community percentage is always involved. That's sort of a, as Justin talked about, sort of a homework, or where kind of everything else goes. So sometimes there's homework, sometimes there's online assignments that will go there, sometimes participation. So other things that are important, but, you know, not the standards. And then I usually have a minimum number of something like a project or a portfolio problem or an application problem. And it's usually either very low or non-existent for the C's, and then moves up for the B's and the A's. And then in there is possibly a final exam modifier. So I like to keep things simple, both for the students and myself. There's a lot of awesome ways to do this, and I've just found, and I'll talk about later, that if I do this as simple as possible, then it really helps me in my organization and things like that. So I don't do anything, you know, very fancy here. And I've also found that, you know, students can understand this system a little bit better. So we do have plus minus grading, and I usually give it if a student is kind of between two categories. So if they've done enough to be in the B category, right? So they've kind of gone through all the things needed for the B category, but not quite enough for the A category. Then I tell them I give plus minus grades at my discretion. I have small classes, so I can, you know, I know the students, I know the work that they've been putting in, I know when they've come to see me during office hours, things like that. So that factors in there, as well as like how close were they to the next category. If they needed to pass, you know, 10 standards and they did 15, but they were, you know, they were low on their learning community percentage, that definitely factors into giving either the plus or the minus, and to which one.
All right, I tend to prioritize simplicity over almost every other goal in a system that I use. The chart design below captures the kind of simplicity I'm going for. The chart accompanies each weekly progress report that I send my students so that they can easily look above, see where they are with respect to that chart. If I have 25 skill-based objectives and each one can be passed twice for 50 total check marks, I usually build in a few other ways for them to earn check marks, like homework, labs, attendance, etc. And in the case of the chart below, there was a maximum of 58 possible check marks. So I see first what the 90%, 80%, etc. breaks look like, and then I massage those cutoffs a bit, and I decided on the cutoffs you see below. For me, certainly in mastery grading, bundles are common, but so far I tend to avoid them. I end up agonizing too much over situations where students overachieve in one area but underachieve in another. So like a student has mastered every single objective, in that mind, that student should get an A. But if I have a bundle where they have to do X amount of the online homework, then I'm starting to wrestle with what the correct grade for that student might be. So I tend to use all graded components, or all the other graded components aside from the objectives, as a sort of buffer, so that they don't have to be perfect in every objective. Chad, what do you say?
All right. So for my spec classes, I use bundles. So I got an example here from, I believe this is a topology class. And you know, the idea is, like with most bundle systems, in order to get a particular grade, they have to meet all the requirements in that column. So I also, well, okay. So I also like simplicity, but before I dive into that, I want to say that one of the things you can do with bundles is you can kind of tailor them to what you want students to know. Like for instance, I have certain assignments like the presentations that I mentioned earlier that might only be required for higher level grades, because I think that it's really there to test, like, you know, higher level skills, like communication or synthesis skills or things like that. So for instance, in this setup, the presentation is only required if you want to get an A or a B. In my current not theory class, in fact, that I'm teaching right now, I have a presentation requirement where the requirements are actually different depending on whether you want to go for an A or a B. If you're going for a B, you need to put together a video presentation based on one of the sections in the textbook that we don't cover. So like you have to do a little bit of research, but it's in the textbook, there's a lot of material there for you. Whereas if you want to get an A, you have to make a presentation based on going out and finding a research article in Knot Theory and making a presentation on that. So it's a little higher level, involves a little more personal research skill. So so that's something you can do to like customize your bundles. But like Tom was saying, I also value simplicity. That's a point I'll come back to a little bit later. I want students to feel like they have agency in the grade that they're going to get. So they need to know what all the requirements are, but they need to feel like this is all I have to do. Like if I just meet these requirements, then I'm going to get this grade. Like it's locked in, it can't go down. The feedback I've gotten from students is that they really like that feeling. I typically don't use plus minus grading. That's just a personal choice. But I do think that my system is simple enough that I generally don't have twists that I need to worry about. If there are twists, they usually come up like during the semester, like something will change. Like for instance, this spring had some significant twists to deal with. And I don't really have a problem changing the requirements if I feel it's necessary. Like I had to do that this spring. I will change the grading chart, but only in the student's favor. I don't feel like it's fair to make things more difficult for them, but if circumstances warrant, I can make things a little easier for them. Also because, especially the first time I run a class, I don't necessarily know if I've got the targets exactly right. So lowering them if I feel like I've overdone it is fine. All right, let's move on to Justin.
So our last main question is, how will I add flexibility for my students and myself? And we're seeing a lot of questions in the chat. Right, when you're looking at bundles and you're seeing like, oh, a student's an A, right? They've got the A mark in all of these categories, but one, right? What grade is that? And if you follow the bundle strictly, it's the lower grade, except if you have some kind of flexibility system for your students. And this also goes a long way towards having student buy-in, right? One of the tenets of mastery grading is that we value productive failure, right? We value mistakes, and we want students to also value those things. And that's why we don't want to give a lot of partial credit. And so we're going to make things pass and not yet. And yet that's really ends up being a high stakes environment, right? So what ways are you going to allow for students to have some flexibility so that the grades aren't so scary? Perhaps that does help with buy-in. So some common ways of getting flexibility in there is are reassessments, right? If you have, if they had an opportunity on a target, when can they do it? What form will that be? How often can they do it? Or you might use something like a token economy. So a token is an in-class currency that students can use to break the rules, right? So they might bump up one of their lower categories using tokens. And so, but you also want to think about, keeping flexibility for yourself. What allowances are you going to allow yourself whenever you're making these calls? So Emily, why don't you take us away on flexibility?
Yeah, so, I kind of offer revisions, a lot of revisions on the standards, and I allow students to come into my office hours and do reassessments on quiz standards. So right now I've had to be a little bit more creative about that, and usually kind of send them something and they upload it within a particular time. But usually I just have them make an appointment and then come to my office hours and then retake some quiz on a particular standard. I do put a limit on the number that they can reassess per week, just to make it so I don't have a million appointments. For the proofwriting courses, on the homework problems, they can revise them just by turning in a revision. I have a Google Drive set up where they've just been uploading those, and then every day or two I'll go in there and grade them. And then I tried to make a maximum of 2 revisions per week for those, and that was going great until the pandemic hit, and then it was kind of a free-for-all. So I'm actually still grading. And so I recommend putting a limit on those things, just so students do them in a timely manner and they're not, you know, looking at your feedback from a proof they did during week 2 and trying to figure it out. I used to use tokens, which is, I think, a pretty common method to give flexibility for the students. But lately I've just gone to kind of having fewer due dates. So I have, you know, online exercises and students can use late passes to do those. So I kind of rather have them do it rather than, you know, use a token to get the points or something like that. I know other people do this in lots of different ways. But for me, having the fewer due dates or the more flexible due dates for students has really diminished the need for tokens. Students will just, you know, I'll just have them do it perhaps late rather than, you know, doing a token. Tom?
All right. Each week, students are allowed to reattempt one quiz over any objective in my skill-based courses. In some cases, students can earn the ability to take a second quiz. For example, if they pass the first quiz in a given week, they may try a second one. But if they didn't pass the first one, then they don't get to try a second one. In our Calc 1 and 2 courses, we have gateway exams where all objectives relating to computing derivatives or integrals are kind of assessed together, where we give them, say, 10 derivatives, they have to compute 9 of them correctly, and passing that gives them all the related check marks for all of those standards. And what we say is if students haven't passed that yet, then they should really be focusing on passing that big hurdle. And once they've done that, then they kind of level up and they can try any 2 objectives they want in a given week. And that holds for the rest of the term. The thought is that before passing that gateway, they should just be spending that extra time gearing up for that. Reattempts may be taken anytime I'm in my office. I found that formal scheduling created more overhead for me than it was worth. I have a decent problem bank for calculus, college algebra, and I can fairly quickly make a new version of a quiz just ad hoc on demand. Because I change all graded components into check marks, students have some flexibility with how they want to improve their grade. If they only need like 2 more check marks for a B, they could get that by completing more of the like pre-lecture reading homework, or by having had really good attendance through the whole semester, or by completing an extra lab, or they can study up for an objective that they need to master and try to get the check mark in that way. Other students may find that different versions, those are going to be more or less time intensive than others. There's a high stress associated with having to pass a particular quiz, but maybe it's more time intensive to complete an entire lab. And now we go to Chad.
All right, so let's see. So I mentioned earlier that I think revisions are critical. Again, I'm talking about mostly grading proofs here, and this process of going back and revising your work and making it better over time is kind of what I'm primarily going for. But so Adriana mentioned asked a question in the Q&A. It's like, how does this constant reassessment not turn your whole life into grading? Certainly with proofs, those take a while, and it's like grading little essays, and I tend to be very slow. So while I want students to be able to reassess like everything, including presentations, I give multiple drafts on that, I have to limit how many they can do. So I will typically allow them to revise basically any problem, but only submit 2 revision problems per week. And that's just kind of based on my own estimation of how much grading I can do and not start falling behind. Because if you start falling behind, it snowballs. So I base everything kind of around that. I grade relatively few problems, but the requirements for passing them are higher. So I still feel like they're getting the work in that I want them to do. I try to be very flexible with deadlines. Because I tend to be a slow grader, my general rule of thumb is that as long as they turn in something to me before I finish grading that assignment, I'll just add it into the pile, even if it's after what I put down as the deadline. And so that gives students a sort of automatic buffer for turning stuff in that they tend to appreciate. A lot of our students, especially our graduate students, are working full time, and stuff will frequently come up at the last minute, and they'll say, oh, I didn't quite get this done. It's fine. You know, I won't have it graded until probably like tomorrow afternoon. So just get it in before then, and it's all good. I'm generally willing to extend deadlines or add extra revisions as necessary. Just yeah, just because I want to give them as many chances as possible to show me that they can do what they need to do without getting too far behind. All right, Justin. Oh, I think we're not getting any sound.
So I have to unmute. Good to know. So as I mentioned earlier, I put a high value on the first time students see a conceptual question, the first time they see a quiz in general. So I tend to not allow reassessments. Revisions are still important to me. You saw that I have a grade category in my bundle that says students have to have so many of their not yets to be revised. So what I do for some flexibility is I allow a student to exchange a token plus a video solution to a quiz to replace a not yet or a pass. If students don't have access to the video equipment, or some students just don't like to be on camera, they can come to my office and do an oral presentation, and then they know they're going to get a couple questions, but those are usually just to help them through, right? But that's generally it for reassessment, with one exception. I will often, maybe sometimes is a better word for it, allow a question on the final to replace a quiz, right? So this happened this semester. My lesson on eigenvalues and differential equations was not well received. The quiz revealed that quite obviously. And I said to the students, okay, you weren't ready for it. Something like this is going to appear again on the final, and I'll count that as this quiz in case you got a not yet on this quiz. So I like having these tokens for these video solutions. Shout out to Robert's paper. Video made the calculus star, I think. That was a very helpful thing for getting my video operations online. And so every student starts the semester with one token. They can earn 3 additional tokens throughout the semester. And I found that, so I let them use them for things like learning community points, attendance, and things that I want to grade on completion anyway, homework points, but almost all of the tokens are used to convert not yets to pass pluses. I'm also going to allow them to modify the thresholds a little bit. But the thing I really like about tokens is that it allows me to encourage some extracurricular behavior that I otherwise don't really have a way to encourage in the course. So if we have a speaker come to campus, I can tell my students, hey, if you go to that talk or watch a YouTube video related to that talk, then you'll earn a token in my course. And it's not exactly extra credit because the token itself isn't worth anything, right? The token also requires demonstration of content mastery in order to get the credit for the course. So now we're going to wrap up things with our pitfalls, or our slide titled, well, that didn't work. Lots of us have had missteps along the way. My mastery syllabi right now are the result of years of doing mastery in as many courses as I can. And so we're going to just talk about, what went wrong. So Emily?
Yeah, I think, teaching or doing mastery grading is itself a mastery process, and I'm still learning. So for me, I think I already said this, but I'll reiterate. I found that when I try to change it up and make things kind of more fancy, it becomes harder for me. And so I tried to use like a 4-tier mastery. This is similar to like the EMRN rubric that people talked about yesterday. And I know this works for lots of people, but for me, it just was really, really hard. And I felt myself kind of deciding between, is this a 1 or is this a 2? And it kind of led me back to thinking about, well, I don't know, is this partial credit? And this was even after I had a rubric for these. So for me, that really didn't work. And I've gone back to just kind of a pass revise system. And I, let Tom's question that he mentioned guide me, which is, like, would the student benefit from doing this again? So I know there was some talk yesterday about, well, if they make kind of simple mistakes, is that still mastery? And you have to decide that for yourselves. But for me, the pass revise system has been by far the best. Tom?
All right, for my pitfalls, I tried a 0/1/2 tier system where I'd give a quiz and grade it out of 2 points. And like this is linear algebra, and if I assigned 2 problems to test kind of the same objective and students got 1 right that tested one aspect of the objective and had no idea how to do the second one, they thought they should get 1 point. But the one was supposed to mean you've mostly mastered it, but you need to clean things up a bit. And so that caused just a lot of headaches that I didn't want to do again because they had a different idea of what points meant than what I wanted them to mean. Various iterations of using the different kinds of spreadsheets led to different communication hurdles and headaches with keeping track of data and incorrectly entering things that it would mess up different students' grades. Everything before pivot tables was painful.
My big thing is my biggest failures in master grading have all come from trying to make a grading system that's overly complicated. There have been a couple notable failures. Like I tried to do something like what Tom was doing with his checkmark system to allow students to like use some of their homework grade to count as a kind of buffer on not passing standards, but I didn't do it in nearly as nice a way. And the result was students just had no idea what their grade was. And I had trouble calculating their grade too. So whenever I've tried to make it like just to add too many nuts and bolts to it, it's just been a problem. Keeping it simple is the best for me, and it's the best for my students too.
Yeah, totally. I have had some hilariously complicated grading schemes that just, I love them in concept, and in practice they were awful for everybody. So simple is good. And as you can see, I have this kind of this quip here, right? That this is something that I've really struggled with and guided me away from reassessments as just kind of taking another similar quiz. Because if I have a conceptual question, it becomes procedural the second time through. That's why I end up placing a priority on those early. But other common things, I use EMRN in theory in my Intro to Proofs class, but I don't ever want to assign the N because somehow, like my R stands for I want you to revise this. And the truth is, as I said in the chat, all of these revisions are learning opportunities, and I never want to deny a student a learning opportunity. So I want them to revise all the things. So I end up just never using that, that lower grade. Yeah, I'm more than happy to talk about that, but let's open it up to some questions. I think we have a couple minutes for that.
So
there is a, so it's come up a couple times, the learning community points in my class is basically things like attendance, and it's things like that I want to grade on completion. So if you have like a flipped classroom model and you don't want the pre-assignment to be graded on correctness, then I call that participating in the learning community, and I give points for that. I almost never take away points for that. Cell phone use, maybe.
So I want to say thank you very much for our 4 presenters here who've done a great job, and thank you also for taking over when my internet suddenly popped out. I think in terms of timing, you 4 have actually done a fantastic job also of answering questions in the Q&A pane, and we are coming very close to the end. So I'd actually like to wrap things up very quickly here. And Tom, thank you. Yep, this is what I'm looking for. If you are looking for tons of details, actually, first, make sure you come to the panels this afternoon. There's 2 parallel sessions of panels. But also, there is a special issue of Primus, which is Problems, Resources, and let's see, oh dear, I should have prepared what the acronym stood for. It is a journal, mathematically, which we have a special issue of on implementing mastery grading in the undergraduate math classroom. And the presenters here, their paper is in that special issue. All MAA members have free access to this, and there are papers with details of many classes at many levels. And for those who do not have access to Primus, you can also find a list on the masterygrading.com resources page, and you will be able to see the authors and abstracts. And I encourage you to consider contacting those authors who have permission to share those if they are willing. So this Build-a-Syllabus Workshop paper is available for free. Thank you to the authors and to the editors of Primus who made that happen, the managing editors of Primus. All right, can we hit the next slide, please? All right, coming up next is another offline lunch break, about half an hour until 12:30 Eastern. And after that will be another table talk session. And the table talk session will be 1 hour starting at 12:30 Eastern. As with yesterday, please join your table talk link based on your last name before you go offline. And you will be in a central room, but once we open the tables, you hopefully will be auto-assigned to the right place. And we've ironed a few things out since yesterday. Sharona, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
No, well, actually there is one thing. After the table talks, when we go to the panels, I want to apologize to those who got locked out of the tech talk. We did fix that issue, so hopefully we should have no issues with people going to any of the panels this afternoon. So thank you very much to those who bore with us during that little kerfluffle.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great lunch if that's what you're doing, and we'll see you in half an hour.